Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy. Now. The flight attendant's voice cut to the cabin like a blade. The 72-year-old man, in the faded veteran's cap, didn't budge from his first-class seat. Around him, passengers pulled out their phones. What happened next would make international headlines and cost an airline millions. But this isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about dignity, respect, and a family secret that would turn everything upside down. In exactly 28 minutes, this airline would issue the most expensive apology in aviation history. Social media would explode, and a CEO would have to make the hardest phone call of his life to his own father. But let's start at the beginning. Flight 447 from Chicago to Denver, a routine Tuesday morning that would become anything but routine. Harold Morrison adjusted his worn veteran's cap as he approached Gate B12. At 72, his weathered hands told stories of decades in service to his country. The simple black T-shirt hung loose on his frame, a man who'd learned long ago that comfort mattered more than appearances. His jeans were faded but clean, pressed with the precision of someone who understood that dignity wasn't about designer labels. Hal carried a folded boarding pass in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. First class, Seat 2A, a gift from his son Michael for his birthday, though Hal had no idea just how significant that gift really was. He'd protested when Michael insisted on upgrading his ticket. "Dad, you deserve this," his son had said over dinner last week. "Just once, let someone take care of you." Hal had reluctantly agreed, not knowing this simple act of love would change everything. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star he kept in a shoebox because he said heroes don't need trophies. Hal Morrison had given everything for his country, only to come home to a nation that barely acknowledged his sacrifice. The medals gathered dust while the memories remained sharp as broken glass. He'd saved 17 men during his service, carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, made decisions that haunted him and defined him in equal measure. Now, walking to the terminal in his simple clothes, nobody would guess this quiet man had once led soldiers through enemy fire. Nobody would know about the shrapnel still lodged near his spine, or the nightmares that still visited 40 years later. The slight limp in his left leg, a souvenir from his final tour, was barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Hal had learned to carry his pain quietly, just as he'd learned to carry his pride. Meet Jessica Sterling. She prided herself on running a tight ship. 10 years with Continental Airways, spotless record, and zero tolerance for passengers who didn't fit the brand. Her manicured nails tapped against her tablet as she reviewed the first-class manifest. At 34, she climbed from economy service to first-class supervisor, and she wasn't about to let anyone tarnish her reputation. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her hair pulled back in a regulation bun, every detail carefully curated to project authority and competence. When she saw the elderly man in jeans settling into 2A, something twisted in her stomach. This wasn't the type of passenger first class was designed for, not in her cabin. First class meant business suits, expensive watches, passengers who looked like they belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. This man looked like he should be sitting in the back of the plane, maybe with a coupon for his ticket. Jessica's eyes scanned his appearance. The faded cap, the simple T-shirt, the worn jeans. Everything about him screamed wrong place, wrong class. Jessica had been passed over for promotion 3 times. Each time, she'd watched younger, more flexible attendants move up while she stayed put. She'd learned that perception was everything in this business, that image mattered more than service, that the company valued those who could maintain the premium experience. And right now, her first-class cabin perception was being damaged by a passenger who clearly didn't understand the unspoken rules of luxury travel. If her supervisor saw this, if corporate noticed that standards were slipping in her section, it might be the final nail in her career coffin. "Excuse me, sir." Jessica's voice carried across the cabin as passengers were still boarding, cutting through the quiet murmur of first-class conversation. Her tone was professional but cold, calculated to establish dominance from the first word. Other passengers glanced up from their pre-flight champagne and warm cashews, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the air. Jessica approached Hal's seat with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being obeyed, her tablet clutched against her chest like armor. Hal looked up from his book, a worn copy of Band of Brothers, pages yellow with age and countless readings, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The cabin's soft lighting caught the silver of his cap's emblem, the distinctive eagle and anchor that marked him as a Marine. Around them, other first-class passengers looked up from their champagne and warm nuts, the atmosphere shifting from relaxed luxury to uncomfortable attention. The leather seats creaked softly. The airplane's engines hummed in the background, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Of course. Hal's voice was steady, polite, carrying the practiced calm of a man who would face far worse than an aggressive flight attendant. He'd learned long ago that respect was earned, not demanded. That dignity came from how you treated others, not how they treated you. He folded his bookmark, a faded photo of his late wife, and carefully placed it inside the book before reaching into his shirt pocket. His movements were deliberate, respectful, showing none of the irritation. He surely felt at being singled out among all the passengers boarding the plane. Jessica studied the boarding pass like it was written in code, her eyes scanning every detail twice, 3 times. Seat 2A, first class. Everything appeared correct. The airline logo, the flight number, the date and time all matched perfectly. But something felt wrong to her trained eye, some indefinable quality that didn't match her mental image of a first-class passenger. The man's clothes, his demeanor, the way he carried himself with quiet humility rather than the entitled confidence she expected from premium customers, it all seemed inconsistent with the expensive ticket in her hands. "Sir, are you sure this is your seat?" Sometimes passengers get confused, especially... Jessica let the sentence hang in the air like smoke, the unfinished words carrying more weight than as she completed the thought. The word elderly didn't need to be spoken to be understood by everyone within earshot. Her voice carried a patronizing tone that suggested incompetence, confusion, a gentle but firm insistence that mistakes had been made. She held his boarding pass between 2 fingers as if it might be contaminated, her perfectly manicured nails creating a barrier between herself and the evidence that contradicted her assumptions. Hal felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not the physical pain from his old wounds, but the emotional ache that came with recognition. It was the same feeling he'd had returning from Vietnam, when people looked at him like he didn't belong, when his own countrymen treated him like an outsider carrying invisible contamination from an unpopular war. The same look he'd gotten at job interviews when they saw his service record. The same tone from store clerks who assumed he couldn't afford what he was buying. 40 years later, and some things never changed. In seat 1B, Margaret Chun, a businesswoman from San Francisco, lowered her newspaper with deliberate slowness. She'd been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, her own memories of discrimination rising to the surface. Something about the flight attendant's tone set off alarm bells in her mind. The subtle condescension, the public humiliation disguised as helpful service. As an Asian American executive, she'd experienced enough workplace bias to recognize it when she saw it happening to someone else. Behind them, college student Jake Martinez had already started recording on his phone, his fingers steady despite his racing heart. Generations he had grown up knowing that injustice documented was injustice that could be fought, that viral videos could accomplish what years of complaints and formal procedures couldn't. His thumb hovered over the live button on Instagram, ready to broadcast his confrontation to his 1,000 followers in real time. "I'm going to need to verify this with a gate agent." Jessica's tone had shifted from questioning to accusatory, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. She held Hal's boarding pass like evidence in a criminal case, turning it over in her hands as if searching for signs of forgery. There might have been a mistake with the seating assignments, or perhaps someone upgraded you without proper authorization. The implication hung heavy in the air, that someone like Hal couldn't possibly afford first class on his own. She pulled out her company phone, making a show of scrolling through contacts, her fingers moving with theatrical precision designed to demonstrate her power over the situation. Hal nodded calmly, though inside, old wounds were reopening like scars pulled tight. How many times had he been questioned about belonging somewhere? How many times had his service, his sacrifice, been invisible to people who judged by appearances alone? At the VA hospital, waiting in line for his disability check. At the grocery store, counting coupons while other shoppers looked on with pity or disdain. At his grandson's school graduation, where other grandfathers wore suits and drove luxury cars while he arrived in his 20-year-old pickup truck, each time he maintained his dignity, remembering that his worth wasn't determined by others' opinions. What Jessica didn't know, what nobody on that plane knew, was that the boarding pass in her hands had been purchased by Michael Morrison. Not Michael the accountant, or Michael the teacher, or even Michael the successful businessman. Michael Morrison, CEO of Continental Airways, the man whose signature appeared on Jessica's paychecks, whose corporate policies she was supposedly enforcing. The same Michael who had struggled to convince his proud father to accept this gift, who had specifically chosen first class because he wanted his dad to experience the luxury he deserved after a lifetime of sacrifice. By now, half the first-class cabin was watching with uncomfortable fascination. Phones were discreetly emerging from pockets and purses, fingers swiping to camera mode with practiced efficiency. In the age of viral videos, everyone knew that moments like these could explode across the internet in minutes, turning ordinary passengers into witnesses to history, transforming a routine flight into a social media phenomenon that could make or destroy careers. As Hal waited for Jessica's investigation, his mind drifted back 48 years, to a time when his worth was measured not by his appearance, but by his courage under fire. The humid air of Vietnam seemed to fill his lungs again, heavy with the scent of jungle and the metallic taste of fear. He was young then, barely 24, with responsibilities that would have crushed men twice his age. Lieutenant Harold Morrison crouched in the Vietnamese jungle, his radio crackling with desperate calls for medical evacuation. 3 of his men were down, enemy fire pinning them behind a fallen tree that provided their only cover from the relentless assault. At 24, Hal had already learned that leadership meant putting others first, always, that the weight of other men's lives was heavier than any pack he'd ever carried. The sound of bullets whistling overhead mixed with the moans of his wounded soldiers, creating a symphony of terror that would echo in his dreams for decades to come. When the shrapnel tore through his back, Hal's first thought wasn't about his own pain. It was about getting his wounded soldiers to safety. The metal fragments felt like liquid fire spreading through his spine, but he pushed through the agony, his training overriding his body's protests. He'd carried 2 of them to the helicopter himself, his own blood mixing with the red dirt of foreign land, his boots slipping on ground made muddy with sacrifice. The medic later said he'd lost enough blood to kill most men, but Al had refused to fall until every one of his soldiers was safe. But coming home was harder than the war. No parades, no thanks, just stares and whispers from people who'd watched the conflict on television while he'd lived it in flesh and blood. Veterans like Hal learned to keep their stories to themselves, to make themselves small in a world that seemed embarrassed by their service. They'd traded their uniforms for civilian clothes, their medals for silence, their pride for survival in a society that had moved on while they remained trapped in memories of distant battlefields. Now, sitting in first class, Hal realized nothing had really changed. He was still being judged, still being told he didn't belong, still fighting battles that others couldn't see or understand. 30 floors above downtown Chicago, Michael Morrison stood in his corner office, unaware that his father was being humiliated in one of his own planes. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating framed photos that told the story of his rise from scholarship student to airline CEO. In one photo, a younger Michael graduated from Northwestern University, while his father beamed with pride in the audience, wearing the same veteran's cap he wore today. In another, father and son stood together at Michael's first day as a Continental Airways executive, Hal's weather hands resting proudly on his son's shoulders. Michael had built his career on the principles his father taught him around their small kitchen table. Respect every person you meet, dignity isn't negotiable, and service to others is the highest calling. When he became CEO of Continental Airways at just 45, his first initiative was a company-wide training program on treating every passenger with dignity, a direct result of watching his father navigate a world that often overlooked veterans. He'd named the program Honor and Service, not knowing that one day he'd watch his own employees fail to recognize the very honor it was designed to protect. He'd purchased that first-class ticket for his father's birthday as a small gesture of gratitude, though I had initially refused the gift with characteristic stubbornness. "Son, I don't need first class," He protested over dinner last week. Save your money. But Michael had insisted, seeing it as a tiny repayment for a lifetime of sacrifices. After years of his father refusing help, refusing handouts, Michael had finally convinced him to accept this one gift, a few hours of luxury for a man who'd given everything for others. Hal had raised Michael alone after his mother died when Michael was 12, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table and dreams alive, never complaining, always putting his son's needs first, turning down overtime when Michael had school events, saving every penny for college tuition. Michael owed everything to a man who was now being treated like a criminal on his own airline, the same man who taught him that true strength came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Jake Martinez hit post and watched his phone explode with notifications. The video of Jessica questioning had already been viewed 50,000 times in 10 minutes. The numbers climbing so fast they seemed to blur together on his screen. Comments pouring like a digital avalanche. This is disgusting. Respect our veterans. What airline is this? The shares multiplied exponentially. 10 became 100. 100 became 1,000, spreading across platforms like wildfire in a digital drought. Jake's hands trembled as he realized he'd just captured something that would change lives forever. Margaret Chen had been posting live updates on Twitter, her executive instincts kicking in as she documented each moment of the confrontation. At Continental Air flight attendant harassing elderly veteran for sitting in first class. This is disgusting. Passenger has valid boarding pass, but being treated like criminal. Hashtag veteran respect. Hashtag flight 447. Hashtag discrimination. Her followers included journalists, activists, and business leaders who immediately began amplifying her message, each retweet adding fuel to a fire that was spreading beyond anyone's control. The hashtag flight 447 was trending within 15 minutes, climbing Twitter's trending topics like a rocket launched into cyberspace. Comments poured in from veterans sharing their own stories of discrimination, family members outraged by the treatment of an elderly hero, and ordinary people who recognized injustice when they saw it. Military support groups picked up the story, veteran organizations began calling for boycotts, and major news outlets started monitoring the situation. What had begun as one passenger's humiliation was becoming a national conversation about respect, dignity, and how we treat our heroes. In Continental's social media monitoring center, alarms were literally going off, red lights flashing on computer screens as engagement metrics spiked beyond normal parameters. Crisis management protocols were being activated, emergency meetings called, and executives pulled from other commitments. The duty manager's hands shook as she picked up the phone to call the CEO, knowing that in the next few minutes, she'd have to explain how a routine flight had become a public relations nightmare that threatened the very reputation of the airline. Jessica returned with backup. 2 more flight attendants and the captain himself, their footsteps echoing through the first-class cabin like an approaching storm. Captain Roberts looked uncomfortable, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between company protocol and basic human decency. But Jessica had convinced him there was a security issue with passenger seating, painting Hal as a potential threat rather than a paying customer. Her voice had been urgent over the intercom. "Captain, we have a situation in first class." Passenger refuses to provide proper documentation for his seat. She'd omitted the part about his valid boarding pass, the part about his quiet cooperation, focusing only on the narrative that supported her predetermined conclusion. "Sir, I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to move to economy or leave the plane." The captain's voice was apologetic but firm, his years of training telling him to trust his crew, while his instincts whispered that something wasn't right. The entire first-class cabin held its breath. Phones recording from multiple angles, witnesses to what felt like a pivotal moment in history. Passengers in nearby seats had stopped all pretense of minding their own business, some openly staring, others recording discreetly, all of them sensing that they were watching something that would be talked about for years to come. Hal stood slowly, his back protesting with sharp reminders of old wounds and older battles. At 72, with metal in his spine and arthritis in his joints, every movement was deliberate, each motion a small act of courage against pain that never fully went away. But his voice, when it came, was steady as steel forged in the furnaces of war and tempered by decades of quiet strength. He looked around the cabin, making eye contact with the passengers who would carry the story forward, ensuring they understood the weight of what they were witnessing. I served this country for 3 tours in Vietnam. I've been questioned about where I belong my entire life. If you want me to move, I'll move, but I won't apologize for existing. His words cut to the cabin's tension like a blade through silk, each syllable carrying the weight of 40 years of discrimination, of battles fought on foreign soil and domestic ground, of a man who'd given everything for a country that seemed determined to give nothing back. The cabin fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the aircraft's engines. Even Jessica seemed to realize she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but pride and procedure had backed her into a corner she couldn't escape from gracefully. Margaret Chun felt tears sting her eyes. Jake Martinez's hands shook as he held his phone steady, and Captain Roberts felt the weight of decision that would define not just his flight, but his conscience for years to come. Michael Morrison's phone rang just as he was heading into a board meeting, the familiar buzz cutting through his thoughts about quarterly projections and market strategies. His assistant's voice was urgent, barely controlled panic bleeding through her professional composure. "Sir, you need to see Twitter immediately. It's about your father." The words hit Michael like a physical blow, his briefcase dropping to the marble floor of Continental's executive suite with a sound that echoed through the hallway. Other executives turned to stare as their normally composed O stood frozen, his face draining of color as he processed the impossible words. Michael's blood ran cold as he watched a video on his assistant's tablet, his hands trembling as he recognized a man being humiliated in the viral footage. There was his father, the man who'd raised him with unwavering love, who'd sacrificed everything for his son's success, who'd taught him that dignity was earned through character, not demanded through position. The same man who was now being treated like a criminal on Michael's own airline, his quiet grace under pressure breaking his son's heart with every passing second of the recording. Michael's next call was to the crew scheduler, his voice carrying an authority that made seasoned executives jump to attention. "Get me the flight crew roster for Flight 447. Now, I want names, employee files, and service records on my desk in 5 minutes." His assistant had never heard that tone from him before. Cold, precise, dangerous in its controlled fury. This wasn't a collaborative leader who made decisions through consensus. This was a son watching his father being degraded, and that son happened to control one of the largest airlines in the country. Within minutes, Michael had Jessica Sterling's employee file on his screen, the pages telling a story he should have seen coming. 10 years of service, but also 3 complaints about passenger profiling that had been buried in HR files, swept under corporate rug by managers who valued smooth operations over uncomfortable truths. Each complaint followed the same pattern. Elderly passengers, minorities, anyone who didn't fit Jessica's narrow definition of first-class appropriate had been questioned, challenged, humiliated, and now she'd chosen the wrong target. Not just any passenger, but the father of the man who signed her paychecks. Michael's call came through to the plane's communication system just as Hal was gathering his belongings to move to economy, his weathered hands carefully folding his book and placing it in a small carry-on bag that had seen decades of travel. The phone in the cockpit rang with the sharp urgency of corporate emergency protocols, cutting through Captain Roberts' pre-flight checklist like an alarm in the night. Jessica stood nearby, watching Hal's quiet compliance with a mixture of satisfaction and growing unease, sensing that something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere, but unable to identify the source of her sudden discomfort. "This is Michael Morrison, CEO of Continental Airways. I need to speak with the captain immediately." The words crackled to the plane's communication system with the authority of absolute power, each syllable carrying the weight of corporate hierarchy and personal fury. Captain Roberts felt his stomach drop, as if the plane had hit severe turbulence, his hands trembling as he reached for the handset. In his 25 years of flying, he'd never received a direct call from the CEO during boarding. This wasn't standard procedure for routine issues. This was the kind of call that ended careers and changed lives forever. Captain Roberts felt his stomach drop even further as the implications hit him like a physical blow. The CEO was calling his plane directly, asking about a passenger situation during what should have been routine boarding procedures. His eyes found Jessica through the cockpit door, saw her standing over the elderly man with bureaucratic authority, and suddenly understood that he'd been played. This wasn't a security issue or a seating error. This was discrimination dressed up as procedure, and he'd been complicit in it. Captain, the passenger you're about to move from first class. That's my father. Harold Morrison is not just a passenger. He's the reason I learned what customer service really means. He's the man who taught me that every person deserves respect regardless of their appearance or their bank account. Michael's voice carried across the cabin through the intercom system, each word landing like a bomb in the tense silence. The phone was on speaker, broadcasting Michael's words to every passenger and crew member in first class. Every conversation stopped. Every passenger looked up from their devices. Every crew member froze in recognition of catastrophe unfolding before them. Jessica Sterling's face went white as the implications hit her like a freight train, her career disintegrating in real time as she realized she just discriminated against the father of her own CEO. Captain Robert approached Hal with a completely different demeanor, his military training overriding his corporate conditioning as he recognized a fellow veteran in distress. Mr. Morrison, on behalf of Continental Airways and personally as a veteran myself, Navy, 2 deployments in the Gulf, I apologize deeply for this treatment. His voice carried the weight of genuine remorse, the kind that comes from recognizing a failure of honor rather than just procedure. The transformation was immediate and total. The man who had been ready to remove Hal from the plane now stood before him with the respect due to a fellow warrior, a brother in arms who deserved better from the very airline his son commanded. Jessica Sterling found herself face to face with the father of her CO, the man she just humiliated based on nothing more than his appearance and her own prejudices. The first-class cabin she'd been so concerned about protecting was now witness to her complete professional destruction. Every passenger watching as her world collapsed in real time. Her hands shook as she realized that every assumption she'd made, every judgment she'd passed, every moment of condescension had been directed at the one person whose opinion could end her career with a single word. The irony was devastating. In trying to maintain standards, she'd violated every standard that actually mattered. But Hal Morrison did something that stunned everyone in that cabin, something that revealed the true measure of his character in a moment when lesser men might have demanded revenge. Instead of anger, instead of demands for punishment, instead of the righteous fury that everyone expected and that Jessica certainly deserved, he looked at her with the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. His eyes held no malice, no triumph, just a steady gaze of a man who understood that true strength came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Miss Sterling, I don't know what happened in your life to make you think someone's worth is determined by their clothes or their age. But I hope someday you learn that respect isn't about appearance. It's about character. And character is something you can't see from the outside. His words were spoken softly, without anger or condescension, but they carried more power than any corporate directive or disciplinary action ever could. In that moment, Hal Morrison became not just a victim of discrimination, but its teacher, showing everyone watching what true dignity looked like when faced with its opposite. Michael Morrison's company-wide email went out within the hour. Today, our airline failed one of our passengers in the most fundamental way possible. We failed to see his humanity. Changes begin immediately. Jessica Sterling was terminated, not for mistake, but for the pattern of behavior that investigation revealed. 3 previous incidents, all swept under the rug, all involving passengers who didn't fit her narrow definition of first class. Continental Airways implemented the Morrison Protocol, mandatory training for all staff about unconscious bias, veteran recognition, and the fundamental principle that every passenger deserves dignity. But the most important change happened between a father and son. Michael finally understood the battles his father had been fighting silently for decades. This story isn't really about airlines or first-class seats. It's about the invisible battles that veterans, elderly people, and anyone who doesn't fit narrow stereotypes fight every single day. The real heroes weren't the executives or the policies that changed afterward. They were the passengers who spoke up, who recorded, who refused to let injustice happen in silence. Harold Morrison never asked for special treatment because of his service. He just wanted the same respect every human being deserves. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who treats everyone with dignity, regardless of their appearance or status. The next time you see someone being judged by their appearance, remember Harold Morrison. Remember that you don't know their story, their sacrifices, or their worth. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the voice that speaks up. What would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it, because stories like these need to be told. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about ordinary people showing extraordinary courage. Because in a world full of headlines about division, sometimes we need reminders about our shared humanity.